I don't think there was a single investigator that walked into that scene that wasn't horrified.
When you look at the photos, it's something that you don't forget.
They saw Dawn Koons nude. Her hands had been bound, and the killer had placed a pillowcase over her face.
The fact that he took away her face, he had absolutely no respect for.
It's really like a blur. I just remember it's like a wall, fell over me.
I kept thinking that, this has got to be a mistake. It was just shocking.
Dawn had indicated that she was scared of him. Maybe he was stalking her.
The missing key, the fact that they had broken up just a couple weeks earlier, it certainly cast a shadow of suspicion.
There was evidence that he had expressed feelings of jealousy.
When you're focused on one suspect and no tips are coming in, how frustrating is that for investigators?
Extremely frustrating. As investigators, it's never over, and we're never going to give up.
Hi, I'm Paula Zahn, and tonight we're on the case in Bakersfield, California, about 2 hours northeast of Los Angeles. It was here in the shadows of the Sequoia National Forest that police began their investigation into the mysterious murder of 18-year-old Dawn Koons. The ambitious teenager had traveled to the West Coast from New York in hopes of launching a career in Hollywood. But the grim evidence at the crime scene indicated that those dreams had been shattered by a ruthless predator. January 16th, 1979. It was early on a brisk Tuesday evening in Bakersfield when the manager at Dawn Koons' apartment building got a call from her boyfriend, Brian, to check on her. Why did Brian suspect there was something wrong?
They had plans to talk and meet, and he had reached out to her for a couple days. Saturday, Sunday, and even into Monday, he had been able to make contact with her. So he also went by her place of employment and spoke to some employees who said that she hadn't even showed up to work, and they were actually going to basically fire her.
Dawn's apartment manager tried calling her phone, but there was no answer. After several knocks on her front door, the manager finally decided to use her passkey to enter. What did the apartment manager find when she checked the apartment out?
When she went into the apartment, the lights were off, and she saw that her bedroom was a little in disarray.
As the manager's flashlight panned across the room, she saw more disturbing signs that something was seriously wrong. By the time she reached Dawn's bathroom, her heart was racing.
That's when she saw Dawn Koons' lifeless body in the bathtub. She screamed, ran out of the apartment, and called the police.
A few minutes later, a team of officers from the Bakersfield Police Department arrived at the scene.
This is Dawn Koons' apartment. When investigators first arrived, they saw that the living room was clean and no signs of a struggle.
But what investigators saw in the bathroom will haunt them forever.
They discovered a horrific sight. They saw Dawn Koons lying on her back, nude, with her legs spread as though she had been posed. Her arms and hands had been bound behind her back, and she had binding around her neck. And the killer had placed a pillowcase over her face.
It was a stunning scene. I don't think there was a single investigator that walked into that scene that wasn't horrified.
I don't either. When you look at the photos, the way in which she was found, It's something that you don't forget.
The fact that Dawn's nude body appeared to have been posed led detectives to quickly formulate a grim theory of the crime. Did it seem apparent to them that the attack had been sexually motivated?
Yes.
In fact, it appeared the teenager had been taken by surprise by her attacker in the bedroom after she had gone to sleep.
The sheets were thrown about, the mattress was exposed, a lamp was knocked over, the telephone was knocked over, and it looked like that's where the struggle happened.
The evidence indicated that the petite young woman had been quickly overwhelmed by her killer, and he had used the cord from her phone to make certain she couldn't fight back.
This is Dawn's bedroom. They saw her phone cords had been cut and wrapped around her hands and placed behind her back.
Investigators believe the violent attack ended in Dawn's bathroom, where the killer had used a final piece of phone cord to strangle her. What did the coroner determine was the cause of her death?
Asphyxiation was the cause of Dawn's death. She had a pillowcase over her head, which was secured by a telephone cord.
The chaotic crime scene and the haphazard way the attack unfolded gave authorities valuable insight into the killer's mindset. When you look at all of the evidence, in particular the phone cords having been cut, did that suggest to you that this was not an organized attack?
The fact that the suspect used items that were on hand in the apartment and didn't bring his own tools certainly suggested that. But then when he got inside, he was in control of what was going to happen. Ultimately, he assaulted her, killed her, and then left her in the bathtub.
The pillowcase the killer had placed over Dawn's head provided investigators with another detail to consider. Was it the belief of investigators that he used the pillowcase much in the same way he posed her body to dehumanize her?
Yes, the fact that he took away her face portrayed her as a faceless female who he had absolutely no respect for.
Police concluded that the rage-fueled sexual attack had been personal, and that covering her face afterwards may have indicated the killer was someone Dawn knew. As officers fanned out looking for a potential witness who might help them move the case forward, they collected a handwritten note that had been taped to Dawn's front door.
It was from her friend, Diane, basically saying, "Dawn, you're never home. Call me."
Detectives hoped that finding out exactly when Diane had left the note would help them establish a timeline of Dawn's last known movements. But before they could talk with her, they first had to break the terrible news to Dawn's family. A loving daughter and sister had been murdered. Bakersfield police were investigating the grisly murder of Dawn Koons. Detectives concluded that the 18-year-old had been killed during a sexually motivated attack in her apartment. Evidence at the crime scene led police to believe the killer may have been someone Dawn knew, and that made talking with those closest to the teenager the first step in identifying a potential suspect. Just hours after the lifeless body of Dawn Koons was found sprawled out in her bathtub, police across the country in New York arrived at her family's home to break the devastating news. What did they share with you?
Police came to the door to advise my father that there had been a homicide and my sister was the one that was the victim. It was just shocking. I was in disbelief.
In a few short seconds, the lives of Dawn's loved ones were changed forever.
How did your mom get through it?
My mother was just devastated, and she just sobbed. I kept thinking that, this has got to be a mistake. This can't be right.
Her brother's loss was magnified by the fact that Dawn had moved to California just a year before her murder. The determined teen had set out on the journey with her high school sweetheart, Steve, hoping to make a career in Hollywood.
What did she tell you about her plans for Bakersfield?
She was driven. She had the acting bug, or she wanted to become a model. So she did things to work toward that end.
Dawn's family explained that while showbiz was her long-term dream, there was another love that was the primary motivation for Dawn's cross-country move.
It was her high school boyfriend. She was moving out there for him.
How did she seem to be adjusting to life on the West Coast?
She got a job at a restaurant. It's called The Breakers. She seemed to thrive.
But Dawn's idyllic life in Bakersfield had recently taken an abrupt turn. The romance that brought her to California had suddenly gone sour. It led to a messy breakup with her boyfriend, Steve.
You knew them as high school sweethearts. Do you think she ever viewed Steve as a person she could marry someday, or was she just too young to think about?
I think she was too young. They argued like typical teenagers. Makeup, breakup, makeup, breakup.
After the breakup, Dawn moved into the one-bedroom apartment where she spent her last terrifying moments alive. Investigators believed that her brother's account of her stormy relationship with Steve made him a person of interest in Dawn's murder. But before police questioned him, they wanted to tighten up their timeline of Dawn's last known movements. Detectives started those conversations with Dawn's new love interest, Brian. The 29-year-old told detectives he had last seen Dawn on Friday, 4 days before her body was found.
He was her current boyfriend at the time. They had been seeing each other for maybe 2 weeks. He actually had said that he had dropped her off at her apartment around 4 p.m.
Although the relationship was just a couple of weeks old, it was Brian who had called Dawn's landlord to check on her after not hearing from her over the weekend.
For a new boyfriend, did that seem odd that he had such a level of concern about her welfare?
I feel that he was legitimately concerned. If this is a person who may be involved in killing her, he's gonna wanna keep his distance. He's gonna wanna stay as far away from her as possible.
Still, police went through all the steps required to rule out Brian as a potential suspect.
He had an alibi that put him at a different location during the time of the murder.
And the next witness officers spoke with helped verify Brian's account. The story that Dawn's best friend Diane told them dovetailed with Brian's. She said that shortly after he dropped her off that Saturday afternoon, Diane arrived to take her to work.
What did they learn from her?
Her co-worker actually picked her up at her apartment around 5 p.m. Went to work together at the Breakers.
Did they end their shift together?
Yes, and Diane drove Dawn home and dropped her off around 10 and actually watched her walk through the front door of her apartment.
Diane came back early Sunday morning. She and Dawn had plans to go horseback riding. But when Diane knocked on the door, there was no answer. Diane left a note for Dawn expressing her frustration about being blown off.
Did investigators think that note had anything to do with the murder?
No, after they talked to Diane, it just helped them establish a better time frame of death.
Based on the evidence, police were convinced that Dawn was already dead by the time Diane returned to pick up her friend that next day. That placed the time of the murder between 10 p.m. Saturday and early Sunday morning. Detectives then asked Diane what she knew about Dawn's tumultuous breakup.
She knew about her ex-boyfriend, Stephen.
What did she tell police about him?
She just said that they had some issues and that Dawn had indicated that she was, scared of Steve and that maybe he was stalking her.
All of the clues detectives had led them in one obvious direction. It appeared that Dawn had been killed by someone who knew her schedule and had been waiting for her that night. The savage attack had been personal and filled with rage. Exactly the type of crime that could be committed by a jealous ex-boyfriend. And that made Steve the prime suspect in Dawn's murder. Police trying to solve the murder of Dawn Koons had identified a window of time in which they believed she had been killed. Investigators were confident the attack had taken place sometime after she had been dropped off at home at 10 on Friday night and before the next morning when she failed to meet her friend Diane to go horseback riding. Investigators had also zeroed in on a suspect in the case, Dawn's ex-boyfriend, Steve. Friends said that Dawn was terrified of him and claimed Steve had been stalking her. Dawn's close friends in Bakersfield told police her ex-boyfriend Steve was controlling and jealous of Dawn's new life without him.
Did anyone else describe their relationship as tumultuous?
Yeah, her mom was not a fan of Steve and had her suspicions of him. Friends indicated that there had been some issues between those two.
One of Dawn's co-workers, a bouncer at the Breakers Bar, added more troubling details.
What did he specifically tell police?
Dawn had been scared of Steve and had indicated that he had been harassing her and bothering her.
And investigators continued to find more reasons to be concerned. Steve had helped Dawn move into her new place after they had broken up, and he legally had access to her apartment.
Was Steve's name on the lease for the apartment?
Yes, both Dawn and Steve's name were on that lease.
Detectives believe they were now ready to bring the 20-year-old in for an interview.
He was the #1 suspect.
What was his reaction to her murder?
Shock, disbelief, and obviously he said he didn't do it.
Investigators asked Steve whether he had ever entered Dawn's apartment without her permission.
Was it true that Steve had a key to Dawn's apartment?
It was thought that maybe he did, but during the interviews, Steve had said that he had given the key back to Dawn and didn't have a key.
Police were skeptical. They had only recovered one of Dawn's 2 apartment keys.
Did they believe Steve when he told them that he gave the key back to Dawn when he broke up with her?
No, I don't think they did. The missing key, the fact that they had broken up just a couple weeks earlier, certainly cast a shadow of suspicion.
But even more crucial for detectives was a careful analysis of Steve's whereabouts on the night of Dawn's murder and whether he even had the opportunity to commit the crime.
His alibi was that he was at a friend's house that Friday night until about 2 in the morning. The next time anyone saw Steve was about 9 o'clock that next morning.
That left a 7-hour window of time without a witness who could verify where Steve had been. Investigators processed the crime scene carefully, looking for any evidence that might connect Steve to Dawn's murder.
What evidence was collected from the crime scene?
At Dawn's autopsy, the coroner performed a sexual assault kit. In addition, the cords that were used to bind her wrists, the cord around her neck, the pillowcase, the telephone, all of that was seized and dusted for fingerprints.
Were there any fingerprints lifted?
Yes, there was one fingerprint that was lifted that at that time investigators weren't able to match to anybody.
Although none of the physical evidence could be linked to Steve, police continued to focus on him as their prime suspect. But in the middle of the intense interrogation, Dawn's ex-boyfriend tried to redirect investigators with his own theory of the crime. He claimed they should take a hard look at one of Dawn's neighbors, who she said had been aggressive with her.
What did he tell them?
He said that Dawn had reported to him that there was a man that had been harassing her. She had even told Steve that that man had entered her apartment without her consent.
Did she ever report these encounters to management?
No, they were never reported to the police or to management. This all came from Steve.
As investigators listened to Steve talk about another potential suspect, was it possible he was just trying to get the focus attention on someone else?
Of course.
Still, investigators identified the neighbor Steve had mentioned and followed up on his tip.
He was cooperative. He answered all of our questions. This neighbor said that he knew her, but he had never talked to her at any length, and he had never been inside of her apartment.
The neighbor even provided police with an alibi for the time frame of the murder. Meanwhile, detectives continued to press Dawn's ex, ultimately getting him to submit to a polygraph. But when Steve passed the exam, investigators were forced to move on.
Were police ever able to eliminate him as a suspect, or did they still suspect he wasn't telling the truth?
Steve was still the primary focus of this investigation, but in all reality, investigation stalled because they didn't have really that piece of evidence to confirm that Steve was the person who committed this crime.
Weeks turned into months, and then years. The case slowly went cold. And that forced Dawn's loved ones to confront a painful reality: that her killer might never be caught. The vicious murder of Dawn Koons had gone unsolved for almost 30 years. And despite the lack of physical evidence, detectives remained focused on Dawn's ex-boyfriend as the prime suspect in their investigation. Over the years, Dawn's loved ones refused to let her case be forgotten, and their relentless pursuit of justice was about to pay off. Dawn's younger brother, Leland, had spent decades trapped in the same painful cycle. Detectives he spoke with would periodically review Dawn's case file and then quietly put it back on the shelf. As the 30th anniversary of his sister's murder approached, Leland vowed that this time would be different.
What was the catalyst for reopening it?
The catalyst was Dawn's brother made a phone call to a friend with the NYPD, and then that detective made a phone call to one of our detectives.
During the call, the NYPD detective offered to get a new investigation national exposure. Bakersfield police took the request seriously, but decided their new cold case unit could solve Don's murder on its own.
We were able to pull off a couple of detectives and assign them specifically to cold cases and take the investigative measures that are necessary to really give these cases the attention that they need.
The new team immediately turned its attention to the evidence that had been collected at the crime scene, in particular, items that might be suitable for DNA testing.
During the original investigation, was any testing done on the evidence?
No, but at Don's autopsy, the coroner performed a sexual assault kit, a rape kit.
And when investigators read the findings in the coroner's report, they saw evidence that made them believe they now had a chance to solve the case.
There was a determination made in 1979 that there was semen present that we were ultimately able to use for DNA testing 30 years later.
Despite that meticulous work, the crime lab's initial testing returned disappointing results.
When the items were submitted to the lab, we do what's called a biological screening of the evidence. We saw that there was male DNA present, but not enough that we could actually upload and search within a national database.
That meant that the cold case team could only do a direct comparison of the evidence to a sample from an individual suspect. Still, investigators believe that just might be good enough, and they knew the first person whose DNA they wanted to test: Don's ex-boyfriend, Steve.
So for more than 3 decades, Steve was never eliminated as a suspect.
He was always the primary suspect.
Bakersfield detectives tracked down Steve more than 3,000 miles away.
They traveled to Florida where they actually interviewed Steve again, and they were able to obtain a DNA sample from him and compare it 1-to-1.
But the results of that testing was not what investigators had expected. His DNA was not a match to the biological evidence.
They were able at that time to eliminate him as a suspect.
For more than 3 decades, Don's ex-boyfriend had lived with the ugly rumors and innuendo. But in the end, police were forced to accept that he had been telling the truth the whole time.
In any of your conversations with Steve, did he ever express what it was like to live under that cloud of suspicion?
It was very difficult because he obviously loved Dawn. It was something he thought about a lot, that there are people out there in this world that think he killed Dawn. And until he was vindicated, it's been a weight on him for his entire life.
The test results were also a blow for Dawn's loved ones.
Did anybody in your family think Steve was responsible?
My mother thought he might have been, but at that point, I think that my mother was just broken. There was always the sadness. I think it tormented her, I really do.
And Dawn's family faced another emotional challenge when police explained they had no additional suspects to test.
How did the investigation proceed?
Investigation stalled.
The setback had detectives on the case just as frustrated as Dawn's loved ones.
You want to bring closure to the victim's family, but as a police department, you want to bring closure to your own department. It shows the public that we are doing our due diligence and we never forget.
And that steely determination led to a lot of painstaking work. cold case detectives went through the massive case file page by page until they finally found a clue that would solve the murder of Don Koons. The Don Koons murder investigation had been reopened. Cold case detectives hoped that advancements in forensic science would help them identify her killer. But so far, modern DNA testing had failed to move the investigation forward. In fact, it actually eliminated their prime suspect. That setback was a crushing blow and left police wondering if the case had hit yet another dead end. Investigators trying to solve the murder of Don Koons were frustrated. DNA testing had cleared their only suspect, Don's ex-boyfriend, Steve. But instead of giving up, detectives went back to the beginning. They did a second extensive search of the case file, hoping to find any of the original evidence that may have been missing. And their meticulous work paid off. When did cold case investigators finally get their big break?
The big break came when the coroner's office located 2 additional slides that had been collected in 1979.
The coroner slides were from swabs taken while compiling Don's sexual assault kit. And more than 36 years later, the biological evidence on them was still viable. Forensic scientists were able to use the slides to do new DNA tests.
We took samples from each and came up with a complete profile.
It was a major break in the investigation. The improved sample contained enough data points to be entered into the FBI's national database.
It was well above the threshold to enter into the CODIS system. We knew we had a strong sample, and I think everyone was just hoping.
And just days later, investigators got the results they had been waiting for. A hit on a new suspect.
Who did the hit come back to?
Prentice Foreman.
No one on the cold case team had ever heard the name Prentice Foreman before. But as detectives dug through the case file, they made a shocking discovery. Foreman's name had come up in the early days of the investigation. He was Dawn's neighbor. Ironically, it was Dawn's ex-boyfriend who had flagged him to investigators as a potential suspect. But despite Steve's suspicions, police had quickly cleared him.
Officers did speak with this man, and the man gave his alibi that he's with another woman during the time of this murder.
Were police able to verify his alibi?
No, they never did follow up with verifying his alibi.
Why do you think that is?
I think they had tunnel vision. I think that they were so focused on Steve that they kind of just dismissed him. Sometimes investigators make mistakes, and in this situation, these investigators made a mistake.
But it was a mistake the cold case team was now determined to correct. Investigators tracked down the young woman who Prentice Foreman had used as his alibi back in 1979.
Decades later, it was you who ended up tracking down his girlfriend. What did she tell you?
She told me that not only was she not with Prentice, she was actually out of state in Texas attending college.
And detectives found evidence she was telling the truth.
That college was able to actually supply me with her transcripts from that time period. She was in Texas.
The DNA match and Foreman's shattered alibi were a critical part of the mounting evidence against him. But Foreman also had a long and checkered history with law enforcement in the decades since Dawn's murder.
He had a pretty extensive criminal past. Burglary, assault with a deadly weapon, resisting arrest, and some domestic violence.
The case was now coming together quickly. But before investigators confronted their prime suspect, they went back to the scene of the crime to sharpen their theory of how the vicious murder unfolded.
This is apartment number 50. This is Prentice Foreman's apartment. It's a two-story apartment, and his bedroom window actually faces towards the parking lot.
That window would have given Prentice Foreman a perfect view of Dawn when her friend Diane dropped her off after work on the night of the murder.
Prentice is able to see the vehicle that she was in being driven away. He then walks from his apartment, which is only about 30 to 50 feet away, to Don Koons' front door.
Detectives believe that it's possible Dawn might not have locked her door that night, or that she may have willingly opened it when Foreman knocked. But there is no doubt that once Foreman was inside, he quickly overpowered the small teenager. Detectives were now confident they were ready to confront their prime suspect.
And how did the arrest come down?
Our apprehension team took him into custody.
Did he say anything to the officers on the scene?
No, he was actually very quiet. He didn't ask very many questions.
But Foreman was a lot more talkative in the interrogation room. He denied having any role in Dawn's murder.
How many times have you been inside of her apartment?
A couple times.
That's it. What kind of a relationship did you and Miss Koons have?
Friends.
Okay. When you say friends, I mean, explain that to me. What do you mean, friend? When did that?
Conversation friends. Friends.
Okay. Let's talk about that.
Investigators continued to question Foreman about his alleged relationship with Dawn, and with each answer he provided, their suspicions grew.
Prentice, I'm having a hard time believing some of the things you tell me.
Well, sir, yes, you're right.
Detective Kerner changed gears and asked Foreman if he had seen Dawn on the night she was killed. Following Foreman's denial, the detective dropped his bombshell.
You're here because we found your DNA.
You found my DNA?
We located some DNA. Do you know where that DNA was located at?
Oh, you gonna tell me it was located in her?
Well, you tell me. I want to know if you know. Where do you think we found the DNA?
I don't know where you found your DNA. You shouldn't have found any DNA.
He was very aggressive. He started hitting the table with his finger going, no, no.
It wouldn't be no DNA here.
Okay.
I immediately knew right then and there he was done.
After the interview, police arrested Foreman for the murder of Dawn Koons. When his trial began on May 13, 2019, prosecutor Gina Pearl used all of the information detectives had uncovered to paint a terrifying picture of Dawn's last moments alive.
What do you think happened that night?
I think Dawn made it inside her apartment. I think she went to bed. And I think that Mr. Foreman, having watched her, he went in to have sex with Dawn. I think Dawn woke up and said no. And at that point, I think Mr. Foreman cut the telephone cords, restrained her, bound her, sexually assaulted her, and then killed her.
And when the jury analyzed all of the evidence prosecutors presented, they agreed. On June 5, 2019, Prentice Foreman was found guilty of the first-degree murder of Don Koons. He was sentenced to 25 years to life. The verdict closed a heartbreaking chapter for everyone who had loved Don, but it also opened 4 decades of old wounds.
Do you remain outraged that Foreman got away with murder for almost 40 years?
Absolutely.
At the tender age of 18, Dawn still had her whole life ahead of her, and Foreman had stolen all of that.
Who would she have been? What would her career have been? What level of success? Where would she have gone? What would she have done? These are the things that were all taken from me, you know, that I could never get back.
She really was a sweet person, and she meant a lot to me. She treated me like a little sister.
How much is Dawn on your mind today?
Daily. She's constantly in my thoughts and a constant inspiration. Her determination, her sparkle, her joie de vivre, that inspires me still to this day.
And it's that same powerful inspiration that has allowed David to find a path forward out of his grief.
What do you want everybody to learn from your journey?
No matter what life hands you, you constantly have to pick yourself up and start again. We didn't have long together, 18 years. I guess it's just the memories that sustain us. I think that's just what keeps us all going on.
For Dawn's loved ones, Prentice Foreman's conviction led to mixed emotions. Relief that their long journey to the truth had finally come to an end, and bitterness over the decades of freedom Foreman enjoyed while they waited for answers. Still, they're incredibly grateful to Bakersfield Police and the prosecutors who never gave up on justice. I'm Paula Zahn. Thanks for watching. Please join us next time when we're back on the case.